Hello, fellow adventurers! Ready to embark on another misadventure? Welcome back to my channel, your gateway to magical stories. Today, we're delving into An Elvish Sweatshop, Episode 9, in the Gretchens Misadventures series by P.A. Mason. In this charming tale, join us as we follow Gretchen on a wacky misadventure, where fiscal catastrophes and justice for the little guy collides. So sit down and relax, and let's unravel the enchantment of An Elvish Sweatshop. Chapter 1. Gretchen stood behind her market stall and rubbed her frozen hands together, cursing herself for not bringing a warm pair of gloves. Heating stones were impractical for the business of hawking her wares, and she resolved to set about heat enchanting experiments when she got home. Not that there was much business to drum up with winter taking hold on the city, but if she could come up with a way to keep regular folks warm, she might see her clientele return. "Come and get your brews before the snow sets in," Gretchen called with hands cupped to her mouth. "A spare dose of cure-all will come in handy with those sniffles." Not to mention that Gretchen had no intention of manning her stall when the worst of the snows hit. And by that time, people would send for the doctor rather than nipping out for a magical solution. Idiots, Gretchen mused. That people trusted those quacks with their ridiculous remedies was obscene. Perhaps it was high time she looked into renting a small shop somewhere in the city. She couldn't afford anything ritzy like the looming buildings which surrounded the marketplace, but she had enough regular customers to make a start someplace else. It would mean a substantial investment, though, and maybe even taking on some hired help. Then there was the inventory to consider. Gretchen shook her head. The prospect all amounted to spending an inordinate amount of time scratching away with a quill while doing sums, and Gretchen had always hated math. There was one compelling reason to consider expanding her entrepreneurial empire, though, and Gretchen smiled as she spotted her ward piper winding her way around the marketplace. Despite the fineries she'd been gifted at Christmas, the kid insisted on wearing a tattered cloak in the city, and Gretchen decided her first attempt at a clothing-inspired warming enchantment would be on the ill-fitting rag. "Hey!" Piper grinned ear to ear. "I got 'em good today. The stink bomb worked better than I thought." "Good for you, kid," Gretchen chuckled before reaching into her purse. "Why don't you run over to the bakery and buy us a couple of pies? You eat yours in the shop and thaw out some." Piper accepted the handful of coins with a nod, and Gretchen couldn't help but smirk. Her ward had come out of her shell in their scant few weeks together, and her skills with a cauldron were really coming along. Terrorizing stable boys with prank potions probably wasn't Academy approved, but her great-aunt Esme always said learning was a journey of curiosity. After selling a couple of cure-all potions and jotting a note that her wart serum stocks were alarmingly low, Gretchen scratched her head, wondering where Piper had gotten to. Then the person she least expected rolled up to her stall. "Cordelia?" Gretchen frowned at her sister, the Vice-Chancellor of the Witches' Academy. "What brings you down from the ivory tower? I got your Christmas card. Yours should be, in the mail. You know how the postal service buckles this time of year." Cordelia only arched an eyebrow and scanned the bottles on her counter. "I'm not as snobby as all that, sister. Can I drop by to see how business is going?" Or lack thereof. Trust Cordelia to come by on a slow day to rub her nose in it. "Sure. What'll you have? I've got a tonic that makes everything taste like apple pie, which is popular with folks trying to lose a few pounds. Not that I'm saying you're out of shape, but we both know apple pie was your favourite when we were kids." There was an echo of amusement on her sister's features, but she waved a dismissive hand and plucked a letter from her pocket. "I believe it's me who has something for you this time. The official response from our claims department, fast-tracked at my request." Crap, Gretchen thought. She'd been hoping her claim for expenses from Christmas Eve would go below her sister's notice. "Ah, thanks." Gretchen plucked the sealed envelope from Cordelia's hand and turned it between her fingers. "I'm sure this kind of stuff is too unimportant for the Vice-Chancellor to handle. I'll take a look a little later and—" "Open it." Cordelia's expression brooked no nonsense. "I'll convey your response to the conditional provisions on settlement." "Conditional what now?" Gretchen curled her lip and tore open the envelope. Scanning past the boring stuff at the top, She squinted at the words conditional approval and then to the passage below. Given the severity of the threat the untrained child poses, you must relinquish her at once to the Academy's care, where she will begin her education post-haste. Gretchen clenched her teeth as the words sunk in and scrunched the letter in her fist. You're blackmailing me. I had a visit from the girl's parents, you know. Cordelia folded her arms. They told me you tricked them into signing her over to you. Asked me to give testimony at court. Did they now? Gretchen snarled. Those deadbeats were set on dumping Piper at the Academy on Christmas Day. She's 10. Be that as it may, Cordelia said, pressing her lips together. I reviewed your report myself. Though it leaves more questions than answers, quite frankly, I have recommended no further investigation into the sums demanded from our treasury. But if the girl is as powerful as you say, we must keep her in safe hands. What's that supposed to mean? Gretchen demanded. Are you saying I'm unfit for the job? Piper is special, all right, and if you think I'm going to send such an impressionable kid into the pit of vipers you call a school before she's of age, you have another thing coming. Cordelia's glare was frosty. Unfit? I can't even see her anywhere. Leave her at home, did you? Forgot where you left her? Perhaps at that dive you call a tavern. Piper chose that moment to show her grubby little face and handed Gretchen a wrapped pie. Blinking at the rapidly cooling pastry, she scrambled for the most efficient way to remove the girl from Cordelia's sight before a screaming match erupted. Thanks, kid. Hey, I forgot. We need some loaves of bread for supper. Mind running back to the bakery? Can I go to the stable after? Piper gave her most endearing smile. Sure, just go easy on those boys this time, huh? After handing over more coin for bread she didn't need, Gretchen watched Piper leave before turning her gaze back to her sister. Cordelia's blood looked fit to boil despite the cold, and Gretchen fought a sense of panic rising in her belly. What? She threw up her hands. She's a kid. Stable boys, Cordelia snapped. Dressed like a street urchin. You have no business rearing children, Gretchen. I don't know how you manage to keep a cat fed most days. Mulligan eats like a king, Gretchen protested. And Piper's only come home with fleas once. Sure, we have some things to iron out, but that contract says she stays with me, and I won't bend to some stupid clause tied to my expanse claim. Oh? Cordelia cocked her head. You'll pay the sum yourself, will you? Have you even looked at the sum from the mayor's office? You could sell the cottage 3 times over, and still not have enough to reconcile the debt. I'll manage. Gretchen tried for a nonchalant look. I've got my finger in plenty of pies, and there isn't any amount of money that would separate me from that kid. And if I agreed to support the Duncans' testimony in court? You wouldn't dare. Gretchen took a step closer and looked her sister straight in the eye. They may give you Piper, all right, but she'll come to the Academy with a crushed spirit and a broken heart. There was a flash of uncharacteristic emotion in Cordelia's eye, and Gretchen hoped she'd effectively appealed to her usually absent sentimentality. Her sister's jaw muscles flexed, and she drew a sharp breath through her nose. What about a compromise, then? You keep guardianship, but agree to send her to board at the Academy. You may have her home on weekends and at semester breaks. It wasn't like Cordelia to offer concessions, but the notion brought up a deep-seated fear that more ambitious members of the Academy would exploit Piper's potential. She needed more time to make the kid witch-wise, grow a proper backbone to keep her from being pushed around. She was too young to grasp the idea of witch politics. No, Gretchen shook her head. Not happening. She's too young to look out for herself. In a couple of years, sure. I have no intention of keeping her from an education. But magic is new to her, and what she really needs is some love and care. From you? Cordelia's voice was shrill. From the witch who just a few scant months ago went herring off headfirst into a cursed labyrinth without a second's hesitation. Children need predictability, routine, discipline. You don't have it in you to offer that. Those words were in essence the contrast between Gretchen and her sister. That they'd been reared in the same household seemed almost incomprehensible. Gretchen squeezed the package in her hand and grimaced as the pie filling oozed through her fingers. I'm sure Aunt Esme would have something to say on the matter. She gave us all the love in her heart and let us grow up our own way. Are you saying she did a bad job? Cordelia's eyes flared and she turned her nose up. For one of us, apparently. Before Gretchen could bite back, Cordelia spun on her heel and marched off. Before she rounded the corner of the stall ahead, she glanced over her shoulder and spat. "Good luck with your bills. The Academy will wait to step in the moment you mess this up." Gretchen dropped the mashed pie to the cobbles and stamped on it for good measure. Everywhere she turned, it seemed there was somebody waiting for her to fail. She couldn't understand why it was so hard to fathom that she could be a decent parent. With misty eyes, Gretchen began the work of dissembling her stall and stuffing the pieces into her infinity pouch, studiously ignoring the folk who lingered and stared. A public spat between two witches, and one a vice-chancellor at that, seemed enough to overcome people's reluctance to dawdle in the cold. Typical, Gretchen thought. After getting her gear together, Gretchen made for the stables, warring with herself. She'd glanced at the bill from the mayor's office only fleetingly, but even that had sent her belly into backflips. She'd figured arguing over the costs would be firmly in the Academy's purview, and had hoped she was done with the matter when she dropped the fat envelope into the hands of a perpetually scowling crone in the claims department. She didn't have anywhere near that kind of coin, but she was damned if she was going to give over easily. Maybe she could set up some kind of payment plan, trade some favours here and there where she could. When she spotted Piper among the stable boys flinging dung, she pushed aside worry and summoned a smile she hoped would be convincing. "Come on, kid. It's too cold out here. Thought we'd shut up shop early." Piper dropped the foul projectile in her hand and shrugged at the boys. They jeered, but in a friendly way, and she skipped over as Gretchen pulled her broom out of her pouch. Her magical vehicle was on its best behaviour whenever Piper was on board, and the pair gently lifted off the muddy track and swept over the walls of the city. It was a long ride home, and Gretchen had a lot to think about. Chapter 2. Gretchen frowned at the tattered robe spread out over the kitchen table with a finger pressed to her lips. She wasn't sure why the heating enchantment refused to stick to the heavy wool, and wondered if it was a matter of material. Usually it was stones she enchanted, and she figured density could be a factor. "What are you doing?" Piper wandered to the kitchen, rubbing her damp hair with a towel. Gretchen startled and looked the kid up and down. "Much better. I thought I was going to barf on the way home. Can't you kids come up with something other than dung to throw at each other?" Piper laughed and shrugged. "I think I spilled some stink bomb potion on my boots." Gretchen puffed out her cheeks. "Way to ruin a brand new pair of boots, kid. That stuff never comes off." Piper had the decency to look sheepish and mumbled an apology. Gretchen felt a pang of guilt. It wasn't Piper's fault she was in a bad mood. Shaking off her sulk, Gretchen smacked her lips as she gestured to the cloak. "I was trying to enchant this robe of yours," she said. "Figured a nice warming charm would keep you from getting sick when we're out in the cold." "I never get sick. Besides, running around keeps me warm." "Yeah." Gretchen rolled her eyes. "About that. We haven't spoken about what we'll do for school yet." Piper narrowed her eyes. "I thought you said I was too young to go." "To the Academy?" "Yeah, but I assume you went to some kind of school in Edgewater, learning letters and numbers and the like." "Yeah," Piper fidgeted. "But I don't want to go back there. Those kids were awful, and now that they know—" "I didn't mean here." Gretchen shook her head. "Maybe someplace in the city. After your lessons you can still see your friends and be out of the cold most of the day." "I don't care about the cold," Piper protested. "And why do I need to learn that stuff when I'm going to be a witch?" Gretchen snorted and planted her fists on her hips. "You think we don't need to know how to read and write? Or maybe that we somehow magic that kind of knowledge? Think about it. I run a business. That includes reading spell books, writing warning labels, adding sums. And don't get me started on taxes." The unimpressed look on Piper's face minded Gretchen of how dull she likewise thought those things were when she was younger. Heck, they were boring now. But with everyone having something to say about Gretchen's parenting skills, she had to admit letting the kid run her own race all the time was irresponsible. She'd resolved to get her ready for the Academy, and stable boys wouldn't teach her what she needed to know. "Look, fair is fair. You've had some time off over the holidays, and now it's time to get our noses back to the grind." The girl made a face. though she looked resigned. "I'd rather be at the academy learning magic than be at a regular school." Gretchen sighed. There was just so much the kid didn't know. "Well, turns out I'm your guardian, and I get to decide. Want to learn magic? You can help me out with this." Piper scowled at the cloak, and Gretchen turned her thoughts back to the problem at hand. Enchanting wasn't her forte, but she'd made plenty of warming stones in her time. If she could just understand the why of it. "Have you tried it on something else?" Piper fingered a hole in the seam. "This is a little ruined." If the enchantment needed everything in one piece, Gretchen thought her venture was already a bust. But she thought back to freezing her backside off in the city and frowned. Wait there. Her winter gloves were of a soft leather with no fancy trimmings. The stitching was in good repair, and if she couldn't get an enchantment to take to leather or wool, she knew the idea was fruitless. Nobody needed heated armour or necklaces that would burn, and a jacket with enough pockets to carry plenty of warming stones would be too cumbersome. Gretchen swept the cloak from the table and dropped the gloves in front of Piper. "Now, the enchantment requires elements of fire. The tricky part is not burning anything." Gretchen puffed on a glowing coal in a ceramic bowl and set it on top of the gloves. "The magic binds the element to the item, you see. Not a problem when you're dealing with rocks, but using the bowl isn't an effective conduit. Do you have a different bowl?" Piper frowned at the gloves arranged in front of her. "Stoneworks, right?" Gretchen blinked, wondering why she hadn't considered that. "The mortar and pestle." She waggled her finger as she fetched it from the kitchen. "You could be onto something, kid." With a pair of tongs, Gretchen transferred the coals into the heavy stone bowl and waited for it to warm. She hadn't consulted her spellbook thus far, and decided she should at least check before she accidentally incinerated her best pair of gloves. "Spellbook time, kid," Gretchen grinned. "You can ask the questions." Piper gulped. Her attempts so far with the unruly book had been unpleasant, but wrangling magical tomes was part of the witch gig, and Gretchen was determined to have her commanding them before she got to the academy. Gretchen knew from experience there was nothing more mortifying than having your peers witness a spellbook tantrum of your own making. "Come on, it'll be fine." She clapped Piper's shoulder and steered her toward the rug in her living room. Having gone through the motions before, Piper stooped to fold a corner back and pried the board concealing her spellbook aside. She picked it up with more than a little trepidation and carried it to the desk by the window. Gretchen watched with her hands clasped behind her back as Piper undid the laces, steeling herself for the inevitable mayhem. Piper cleared her throat and braced her palms on the desk. "Tell me how to enchant gloves." Gretchen winced. The question was broad to say the least, and the spellbook flipped open violently. With pages vibrating, a gust of wind rattled the window casing, and a pair of illustrated gloves leapt from the page toward Piper's face. The poor kid held an arm up to protect her eyes, and Gretchen stepped in to wave the gloves aside. The book jostled on the desk, and Gretchen brought her fist down on it with an audible thump. "Enough!" She nudged Piper out of the way. "An enchantment to warm leather. Can it be done?" A yowl came from the sofa, and Gretchen figured the gloves had caught up to her feline familiar. The spellbook made a noise not dissimilar to maniacal laughter, and Gretchen scowled. "Proud of yourself, terrorizing kids and cats." The laughter turned to a grumble of sorts, and the tome stretched and snapped to a crisp new page, with a picture of the warming stone enchantment she was used to, except for one slight change. "Ah-ha," Gretchen rubbed her chin. "Didn't think of that." Piper poked her head around Gretchen's elbow and frowned at the page. "What?" "Well, enchanting a rock calls on the element of earth. The coals represent the offering." She pointed to a symbol on the page. "Leather is of the flesh. It needs a fleshier offering." Piper's nose wrinkled, and Gretchen clapped her shoulder with a chuckle. Yeah, I'm sure your folks filled your head with all kinds of nonsense on blood sacrifices, but it's really nothing that can't be remedied with a snippet of Mulligan's dinner." The spellbook snapped closed, and Gretchen gave its leather cover a pat. After handing the tome to Piper to stow away, she fetched a small portion of entrails from the cellar and dropped the lion's share into her familiar's bowl. "I'm glad Monty eats fruit." Piper made a face at Mulligan, tucking into his dinner. "Don't underestimate the value of offal, kid." Gretchen waggled her eyebrows. It can be really handy if you have the knack for divination, and it costs a lot less than most magical ingredients. Gretchen held the sliver of meat above the coals and met Piper's eye. The kid chewed her lip thoughtfully and held out her hand to prepare for the link. Gretchen tried to be mindful of the girl's considerable power, but she was already learning to offer up only what was needed, unlike the night they'd met. Gretchen focused her thoughts on the charm and dropped the offering into the bowl. It fizzled and hissed, and a tendril of steam snaked upward. Gretchen wove magical threads around the gloves and encircled the coals within the web. With runes already marked on the table, she touched each one, and they flashed from chalk to bright green as they activated. With the energy concentrated, she gave Piper's hand a squeeze and uttered the words that would bind the element of heat with the leather gloves. Coals flared, and the runes grew brighter, and once the spell was complete, they both faded, leaving a lump of ashen coal and dirty grey streaks on her table. "That's all?" Piper leaned over to inspect the remains. "Did it work?" Under normal circumstances, Gretchen would have been less assured to give an affirmative, but her skill with enchantments had improved since opening up the stall in the city, and since Christmas Eve her magic had become stronger, and for the most part unwavering. "It looks right. Why don't you try them on and see?" Piper slipped the oversized gloves on her hands and quirked an eyebrow. "How?" "Repeat the incantation." Gretchen held back a smirk as Piper mouthed the words clumsily and wondered how she could adapt the charm to suit regular folks, assuming that could be done. Piper blinked, then stood a little straighter, and Gretchen thought belatedly that using the kid as a guinea pig probably wasn't the best idea. "It worked!" she exclaimed. "They're perfect." "Excellent," Gretchen sighed. "We should probably do something about that cloak before morning." Fighting a yawn, Gretchen slumped into a chair and wiped absently at the chalky mess on the table. That kind of magical energy expenditure was always tiring, but it didn't look like the effort had punched any wind from Piper's sails. She held the gloves to her cheeks with a rapt expression, and startled when a knock came at the door. "What now?" Gretchen groaned, dropping her head back to stare at the ceiling. If it was a summons to court from Piper's parents, she was of a mind to shoot the messenger boy. "I'll get it." Piper skipped to the door before Gretchen could protest, and when it swung open, she was pleasantly surprised to see Gavin on her threshold with a bundle under his arm. "Evening," the silversmith nodded. And evening it was. Gretchen frowned past him at her garden and wondered where time had gotten to. "Come in. I was just about to put the kettle on." Gavin and Piper chatted away while Gretchen prepared a tea tray. They had seen little of the burly smith since Christmas, but after that troublesome night, he and Piper had become fast friends. Gretchen frowned at the package on the table as she settled herself to sit, and hoped it wasn't more damaged goods she'd have to pay for. Her new debt felt suddenly crippling, and she summoned a tight smile as she poured for her guest. "What brings you here at this hour?" "Those frogs," Gavin puffed out his cheeks. "I was hoping you could help me out with something." Gretchen rubbed her eyes and refrained from groaning. The frogs, or toads, depending on who you spoke to, were still the talk of the village. The subject was divisive, and while the publican of the seedy apple was having all kinds of trouble keeping the critters out of his booze, there seemed to be unanimous agreement that vermin had vanished from Edgewater entirely. "Giving you a hard time at the forge?" "I've given up on trying to keep them out." Gavin took a sip of tea. "Instead, I just lock away whatever is small enough for them to make off with. But I was working on a plate last night, and when I woke up this morning, this had happened." Gavin undid the laces of his leather satchel and drew out a fine silver bowl etched in an intricate design. Except, is it glowing? Gretchen leaned in closer and decided she wasn't seeing things. "Well, I'll be." The surface itself seemed to shimmer and gave off a mother-of-pearl shifting colour. The etched design stood out in a brilliant contrast, and Gretchen tried to fathom what kind of magic was capable of doing such a thing. "So, someone broke into your workshop?" Gavin shook his head and exhaled. "Well, I should think it's obvious. The only thing that's changed in my forge are these." Gavin set a jar on the table with a red Krampus frog inside. Its expression somehow seemed annoyed under its stubby little horns, and Gretchen eyed the creature askance. "You think the toads did it? Do you have any other explanation?" Gavin's voice was tart. "I just need to know how it was done. If I could replicate the effect, well, I'm sure this bowl is worth 10 times as much as it was when I crafted it." Piper had commandeered the bowl and was tracing the etching with her finger. Gretchen sniffed an opportunity and the weight of responsibility, and decided the conversation she needed to have would be better without prying, little ears around. "I think it's about time Monty will be out." Gretchen nodded to the door. "Why don't you see what he thinks of the gloves?" Piper's face lit up at the mention of her new familiar, and it brought a genuine smile to Gretchen's lips. "I'll bet he loves them," Piper said. Gretchen watched the girl scamper out of the house and turned her eyes to Gavin, who gave her a knowing look. I have news of my own." Gretchen took a deep breath and recounted the conversation with Cordelia. "They won't pay." Gavin rubbed his hand over his mouth. "What are you going to do?" "I'll come up with something." Gretchen shrugged. "But I'd appreciate an extension on what you're owed. I'll have the mayor breathing down my neck before too long." Gavin emptied his satchel on the table and a pile of smaller silver plates slid out. "You get the frog to do the glowing thing on a scale we can put to mass production, and I'll call the debt settled altogether." Gretchen let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. That was one burden lifted, so long as she could get the frog to play along. Chapter 3. Sleep didn't come easily, and Gretchen spent the better part of the night tossing and turning with 2 words bouncing around her head: mass production. When the birds began chirping outside her bedroom window, she tossed back the covers over a disgruntled mulligan and pulled on her knitted slippers. She needed a small fortune to pay for the clean-up bill of an entire village, and the means to get her hands on it quickly. With magic at her disposal, all it would take was a spot of ingenuity and a partner. Piper had left the enchanted gloves on the table the night before, and Gretchen pulled them on with a whispered incantation. The enchantment was responsive, and Gretchen's fingers tingled as the gloves warmed up. The only problem was getting them to work for non-magical folk. It would take a lot of testing and perhaps be fruitless anyhow, and even if she pulled it off, it was more than grey area territory with the academy. She could very well be expelled from the witch community for pulling a stunt like that without their approval, and she knew darn well Cordelia wouldn't lift a finger to help her. But she was already in their bad graces, and membership was getting a little steep anyhow. There were hedge witches who skirted the magical society, living on the outside and usually someplace out of the way. She'd have to give up her stall in the city, but if the venture was suitably profitable, it could make up the difference, and she'd still have Piper. That was what mattered. Her ward stumbled out from her bedroom, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Are we going early today?" Gretchen tugged off the gloves and smiled as she went to put the kettle on. "Yup, we have a delivery of hides to take to the city. Good timing, really. I think the fella I need to see might be interested in these gloves." Piper pulled up a stool at the counter and yawned. "You want to sell them?" "Not these ones." Gretchen smirked and readied the teapot. "I think we could make a whole lot more." The kid didn't seem impressed with the entrepreneurial notion, though Gretchen readied their breakfast with a growing sense of excitement. She didn't expect a 10-year-old to appreciate the finer points of commerce or the financial spot they were in. After breakfast and getting ready for the day's trade, it took everything Gretchen had to keep from running out the door. Armed with her new warming cloak, Piper followed her out to the yard, and Gretchen prepared them for takeoff. It wasn't her usual habit to fly into Edgewater, but she wanted to make good time and get to Ewan the leathersmith before the day's trade began. The man made it no secret that he wasn't her biggest fan after the prank she'd pulled with the hair potion, but she hoped to entreat his good business sense. If she didn't make headway with him, there was always his brother Cal, she reasoned. But to get the kind of buy-in she wanted, she'd need both the brothers' goodwill and coin, lots of coin. Billy, the butcher, was already in his yard when Gretchen and Piper touched down, and he gave them a friendly wave. "I was wondering where you'd gotten to," he chortled. "These hides are starting to pile up." A duty Gretchen admitted she was getting a little lax on. "Sorry, Billy, things have been a little busy." "So I see." The butcher grinned. "This be the young witchling, then." Gretchen clapped Piper on the shoulder and followed her worried gaze to the sacks of curing salt in the corner. She gave her a squeeze, knowing the yard itself was a sore point for the girl after the Krampus summoning, and wondered if Billy knew his establishment was the source of the plague. "Yep, this is Piper, a fine young witch in the making." "Very good. Now let me just get these hides cut for you." After slicing and rolling the stinking pile, Gretchen stuffed them into her infinity pouch as Piper watched on with arms folded. She supposed a little warning on the stench should have been warranted at breakfast, and knew it would take days for the miasma to dissipate completely from her pouch. "And I don't care what anybody else thinks," Billy declared. "Those red frogs hopping about are a right blessing. This place has never been cleaner. Flies are always a problem for a butcher, and I haven't seen a single insect in my shop since Christmas, and they don't trouble the meat either. I won't hear any different, even from the likes of—" "I'm glad you like 'em, Billy. Listen, we have to run. Traffic at this time of morning can be rough. Don't want to be flying into a flock of geese. I'll be around later this week to pick up some gizzards. You have a good day now." Gretchen grabbed Piper by the elbow and flashed a bright smile to the butcher before hurrying out of the yard. "That could have gone on for hours," she whispered, then puffed out her cheeks. Piper said nothing, and Gretchen left the girl to her thoughts. While she'd come out of her shell since Christmas, their infrequent trips into Edgewater left her quiet and withdrawn. It must be hard to leave behind prejudiced views ingrained by a magicist family, and her arrival in Edgewater had been rough from the start with the local kids. Gretchen hoped in time she would see the village as home and shake off sour notions of how people saw her. The morning was as cold as could be expected, and on the trip into the city, Gretchen was grateful for Piper's warming cloak pressed up against her. Performing 2 enchantments had left her exhausted the night before, and she knew if her plan for a business arrangement came through with the leathersmiths, she'd have no energy to spare. She worried it could be already too late into the season to be peddling warming charms, and by the time they hit the marketplace, it would already be time to start thinking about cooling shirts. Innovation was sounding a lot like hard work. The stables were busy when they touched down in the city, and Gretchen prodded Piper to keep walking and leave the lads to do their work. The tanning warehouse wasn't far from the stench of the stables, but Gretchen decided on going straight to their more pleasant-smelling shop in the marketplace first. "So, what are we going to do?" Piper frowned up at her as she strode briskly to keep up. "Ewan and his brother Cal run the outfit that supplies the Royal Armoury with their leather goods," Gretchen said. "Those hides we picked up go to their warehouse. They don't exactly owe me a favour, but I'm hoping there's at least a little goodwill on their part. We go show 'em the gloves to gauge interest and get a few more pairs for testing." The marketplace wasn't bustling at the early time they arrived, with only traders of fresh produce and baked goods already set up. Gretchen had always opened up a little later, knowing people didn't tend to want their potions until the afternoon, and was glad to see the leathersmith's door still bolted. She slipped down a neighbouring alley with Piper in tow and banged on the side door with her fist. When it swung open, it was with a bark from a man with bushy eyebrows and a thick carpet of magically induced hair on his previously bald pate. "About time I was wondering where those buckles—" Ewan blinked at Gretchen, then Piper, and wrinkled his nose. "Oh, it's you. I was beginning to think you'd reneged on our deal." Gretchen saw where this was going and stepped in past him before he could slam the door in her face. "Ewan, happy holidays to you too. I must say your hair is looking magnificent." Gretchen tugged Piper in by the hand as Ewan stammered and strode down the hallway into the back of the shop. "I've got the hides right here. Hold up with production, as I'm sure you can appreciate. Did you hear what happened in Edgewater at Christmas? It was an inconvenience for sure, but the new frogs hopping around are seen as a boon by some—" "Why are you here with the hides?" Gretchen looked over her shoulder to see Ewan red-faced with outrage. "They're to go to the warehouse. I must insist you leave now before you fill my shop with that stink." Gretchen rounded the corner and blinked at a row of benches along the far wall. Instruments for stitching and tooling leather lay discarded by half-finished items, almost as though the craftsman had stepped out for a cup of tea. "Well, I'm not here just about that, you see. I have a proposition for you, one that could make us both bags of gold." Ewan sidled past the pair to insert himself between Gretchen and the workbenches. And what would a witch have to offer a leathersmith, eh? I'll have none of your tricksy potions in my shop. We have a reputation to uphold, and I'll be cold in my grave before associating myself with— How about heated gloves? Gretchen shrugged off the insult and waved the enchanted gloves with a smarmy grin. Sold by the finest leathersmiths in the city. I don't even want my name on the door, pal. Just a cut on the profits. Ewan's mouth worked as he stared at the proffered accessories. Gretchen pulled them on with a whispered incantation and flexed her fingers as the warmth spread. She tugged them off gently and handed them to the flummoxed leathersmith. He startled as they fell into his palms. But, he swallowed, are these even legal? Have you any papers from the relevant authorities? And how does one activate such an enchantment, unless— I'm still working on it. Gretchen held up her hands. And no, these don't come with a seal of approval from the Academy. But you won't have to worry about that. Legal jurisdiction and all. It'll be me they come after. Ewan scowled and shook his head. An enchanted item, which could very well be outlawed by next season. And what does working on it mean? Oh, come on. You know, once they're banned, they'll be twice as popular. Don't tell me you wouldn't have half the lords and ladies clamouring for their own pair. And if you don't give me up to the Academy, it could take years before they figure out who's behind it. I've got the hard part done. Now I just need a few more pairs to do some serious testing on. There has to be a way to get them working for regular folks. It'll just take some trial and error. Ewan barked a laugh and sneered as he handed the gloves back. Oh, this is rich. You haven't even figured out the sorcery behind it, and you expect me to hand over my inventory for you to blow up. Or did you expect me to sell these with a free witch to work the magic? Gretchen clenched her jaw and tucked the gloves under her belt. I'm offering you the opportunity to be on the cutting edge of innovation, to be partners from the very first step. I would have paid for the materials for a prototype. All I would have asked was a wholesale price. Ewan rolled his eyes. Innovation? If this could be achieved, then tell me why it hasn't been done before. How do I even know these things won't combust and take some poor fellow's hands clean off? The Wizards Guild is the only reputable source of commercial magical items. You witches should stick to mixing those foul potions. Fine, Gretchen spat. Reaching for her pouch, she undid the laces and began hauling out hides to dump on the floor. Consider your hides delivered. You're going to regret the day you turned me down, you misogynist twerp. Ewan cursed as the hides rolled over his workshop floor, and Gretchen gave the nearest one a nudge with her boot. Looping her pouch back around her belt, she held a finger up under the leathersmith's nose. And you can find some other sap to ferry these things around. She felt a tug at her belt and reached to pat Piper on the shoulder. Ewan's face burned scarlet, and Gretchen turned before he could start spewing more hateful nonsense. After stomping down the hallway and out into the morning, Gretchen heaved a deep breath and turned regretful eyes to her young ward. Sorry you had to see that, kid. Some folks are just always going to have it in for witches. It had probably been a bad idea to take Piper along anyhow, Gretchen mused, but she was so sure the idea would be a hit, and part of the success was Piper's too. That's okay. Piper shifted uncomfortably. Can I go to the stables now? Gretchen puffed out her cheeks and nodded. After their talk the night before, she'd hoped to make some inquiries at nearby schoolhouses, but in her foul mood, she decided it could wait. It was going to be a long day in the marketplace. Chapter 4. After fixing dinner in silence and stewing on the morning's events, Gretchen undid her belt and hung it on a loop by the door. The gloves fell to the floor, and she scowled at the items as she picked them up. Are we going to look in the spellbook again? Piper chewed her lip. See if we can get them working without the incantation. Not tonight. Gretchen's limbs felt heavy, and all she wanted was a strong cup of tea. If I want to get the new batch of wart serum ready for tomorrow, I'll have to get up before sunrise. Selling medicinal wares was honest work, and usually Gretchen didn't begrudge the extra hours involved in running her own business. But with her newfound money troubles, it all seemed pointless. Okay. Piper hefted Gavin's satchel from under the table and pulled out the silversmith's jar with the frog inside. But shouldn't we be feeding the Krampus frog? What do they even eat? Gretchen blinked at the creature scowling at her from its enclosure, and chided herself for forgetting her other obligation. At least that venture could cross a sizable sum of money off her debts if she could figure it out. Let me see. Gretchen dug out a bottle of double-distilled witch's brew from the back of her cellar and weighed it in her hand as she considered the frog. Booze and silver were what got them out of trouble with the Krampuses on Christmas Eve, and Gretchen wondered if the two were tied somehow. Picking up the satchel with the silver plates, she nodded to the jar. "You bring that guy. I think we should set up this little experiment in the greenhouse." The pair tracked out into the night, and Gretchen puzzled over the mystery of the glowing bowl. Not a lot of information was available about Krampus magic, and even less about the Krampus frog brand of sorcery. While she was certain the plants stowed away in her greenhouse would be ruined come morning, she had no other suitable enclosure for an amphibian. The frog could catch its own insects, and if a stiff drink helped it along, all the better. Piper unbolted the door to the squat greenhouse, and Gretchen bent as she stepped inside. The green tangle within would have had her great-aunt Esme in fits if she saw it, but Gretchen had come to terms with the fact that she couldn't keep on top of everything around the place. It made more sense to buy ingredients in bulk since starting up in the city, though she hoped there came a time when she could get back to the humble work of cultivating. "Shall I let it out?" Piper began picking at the wax holding the lid in place. Gretchen pulled the door behind her and shuffled further in. "Sure. Pass me that saucer, would you?" Gretchen poured a good measure of liquor in the shallow bowl and set it on a stand next to a wilting pot of hydrangea. She cleared some space next to it and set out the silver bowls side by side. "Drop him in here." Piper popped the lid open, then tipped the jar over the saucer. The Krampus frog seemed reluctant to let go, his sucker pads holding onto the glass. Gretchen gave the jar a firm tap to pry him free. He landed in the saucer with a small splash, and Gretchen and Piper watched closely to see what it did next. Its tongue flickered out into the liquor, and it shuddered. After writhing in the bowl for a second, it hopped out onto a silver plate and croaked. "So, what do we do now?" Piper asked, setting the jar down. "Process of elimination, kid," Gretchen said. "We leave it overnight and see what happens. If it's a bust, we think how to go about recreating the conditions of Gavin's workshop." Piper made a face and turned to another crowded shelf of neglected plant life. "What's this?" She pulled down a small pot with a sprouted pine cone nestled in the soil. "Huh." Gretchen took the pot from Piper with a smile. "I forgot about this one. Took a fancy to growing some bonsai after seeing a shop in the city. I didn't think this one would work." Piper nodded politely, though Gretchen could tell her horticultural exploits weren't at all interesting to the youngster. She set the pot on the scant clear space on her potting bench and wrapped her arm around the girl's shoulder. "Come on, I'll make you some cocoa before bed." Piper must have been tired, because she didn't begin pleading to stay outside with her bat familiar. Gretchen spotted the creature upside down in her fig tree and wondered how much dried fruit the bat had filched so far. She reminded herself to check the barrels at the back of the garden when she got a chance. Internally bemoaning the list of things to do when she got a chance, Gretchen wiped her feet by the door and startled when Piper cried out. She pushed past the girl into the cottage and likewise stopped short at the sight of her kitchen table. Sitting nonchalantly with legs dangling off the edge was an elf who couldn't have been taller than her knee. Gretchen wrinkled her nose at the stench of raw hides and blinked at her pouch on its hook, the laces hanging limp. She opened her mouth to demand answers, but all that came out was an undignified croak. "My apologies." The elf pushed himself to his feet and bowed. "I had no intention of upsetting you, but I simply couldn't leave without offering gratitude to my saviour." "Saviour?" Gretchen turned to look at Piper, who peered around her shoulder. "Did you have something to do with this?" Piper's mouth hung open, and she shook her head, never taking her eyes off their unexpected visitor. Gretchen frowned at her pouch and started piecing together the puzzle. "A stowaway, huh? Thought you'd hitch a ride in my pouch. How'd you get in there, anyhow? Aren't you a little small for an elf?" Gretchen clicked her teeth shut, figuring she'd better let the little guy get a word in. "I took my opportunity without your consent when it arose, for which I must make amends. But we'd been in that workshop for years, and—" "We?" Gretchen spun in a circle, casting around. "What do you mean, we?" "Alas!" The elf's shoulders slumped. I was the only one to make it, but I swear on my honour I shall return and free my brethren from their slavery. Slavery? Gretchen remembered the bottle of witch's brew in her hand and pulled up a chair at the table before taking a healthy swig. Do you mind slowing down a little and telling me what in tarnation is going on? Piper skirted the table and stood behind Gretchen's chair. Catching herself before she passed the liquor to a 10-year-old, she put the bottle on the table and puffed out her cheeks. Mind putting on the kettle, Piper? I get the feeling this is going to be a long story. The elf waited with his hands clasped, and Gretchen gave him a nod when Piper returned to sit by her side. He cleared his throat as though trying to figure out where to start, then sat cross-legged in front of them and offered a bright smile. My name is Bertie. I am an Arctic elf, which may account for my size. I have heard whispers of cousin elves who are giants if the stories are to be believed. Nice to meet you, Bertie. I'm Piper. The girl leaned closer eagerly, but Gretchen wasn't convinced the painfully polite elf was a friend just yet. Arctic elf. Right. Now what about the rest? Of course. Bertie shot a sheepish look at Piper. My kind live in hiding for the most part, in tunnels deep beneath the snow. We live in fear of those who would do us harm. Nomadic yetis are known to snatch us elves up by the dozen and make off into the night. Back before I was captured, I thought perhaps they ate elves. Now I know different. They may look brainless, but they are cunning when it comes to wheeling and dealing. Gretchen's brow furrowed. They sold you? Afraid so, the elf confirmed somberly. Piper gasped, just as the kettle began whistling. Why don't you bring the tray over, Piper? Maybe with some of those cookies we picked up from the baker. Piper shot Gretchen a suspicious look and backed into the kitchen, keeping watch on the conversation. Gretchen was learning there was little the kid didn't pick up on, and resigned herself to wait until she returned. When they each had a steaming cup in front of them, Bertie's the smallest Piper could find, Gretchen gave the elf a sharp look to continue. He grinned around a mouthful of food, and Gretchen thrummed her fingers on the table expectantly. Traders that venture that far north spend many months at sea, we learned. We spent much of that time in the hold pent up in wicker crates. We caught snatches of conversation here and there. It wasn't the first time they'd come across our kind. He took a sip from his oversized cup. From there they sold us on to a brute of a man in a dirty seaside town. We remained caged in his caravan for weeks before the master arrived. The master? Piper chewed with her mouth open, and Gretchen refrained from reprimanding her for the lax table manners. The leathersmith. You addressed him as Ewan. Ewan? Gretchen snorted, and cocoa sprayed across the table. He bought you? He took an interest in our crafting skills. The merchant assured him Arctic elves are renowned artisans. While it didn't surprise Gretchen that the man would take any opportunity to get an edge on his competition, she wondered at the brazen nature of keeping slaves in the city. Some kind of indenture, maybe, but an outright transaction. That kind of thing was widely condemned and a source of ongoing diplomatic tension with the southern continent, who had fewer scruples on the matter. But right there in the city, in his place of business, you guys were there the whole time. Gretchen recalled Ewan's reluctance to let her inside in the first place. That's despicable. We were in a warehouse for some months, but the brothers feared someone would discover us. We aren't suited to their tanning operations. They employ men for those jobs. We thought perhaps slavery was commonplace, but their secrecy changed our minds. Gretchen's mind raced, and she felt awful as the image of the abandoned workbench in Ewan's shop lurked in her mind. Trafficking and slavery are absolutely illegal here, she assured the elf. Not that you don't hear of those sorts of things going on from time to time, but it would be imprisonment if someone was caught. It's the catching that's the tricky part. Gretchen stood and tapped her finger to her mouth, trying to consider logically how to make Ewan and his brother accountable for their crimes. How many of you are there? Piper asked. 10, Bertie sighed, including my nettle. A few didn't survive the journey across the sea. Before the elf could go into any amount of morbid detail, Gretchen interjected, saying, We can expose him for this. The simplest thing to do would be to contact the authorities, but I'd say that slimy mongrel is too clever for something like that. I mean, we were right there and had no idea. You'd help me? Bertie stood, and his little eyes shone with emotion. To free the others? Well, of course I would, Gretchen huffed. Aversion to slavery aside, I've got a score to settle with that twit. The look on Piper's face was enough to chasten Gretchen, who in hindsight thought a good deed done to achieve one's own end didn't sound all that charitable. We witches need to look out for the little, well, that is to say, those on the fringes of society like us. That sounded better in Gretchen's estimation. I'll bust your buddies out myself and see that Master Ewan is suitably punished. Thank you, mistress. The elf bent so low, Gretchen thought he'd knee his little forehead. We shall be forever in your debt, and would work to repay your kindness. Our skills with leather notwithstanding, you'll find our dexterity can be put to a wide variety of applications. The name's Gretchen, and I'll not have you trading one overlord for another. She gave the grovelling elf a shrewd look. I said I'd help set you all free. After that, you're on your own. The notion that a squad of half-sized leather craftsmen with the skills to outfit her with all the gloves she needed didn't escape her notice. But there was something about Bertie's gullible little eyes that made her feel uncomfortable. And deep down she worried that Ewan was right. Maybe warming gloves for the masses hadn't been invented yet for a reason. Chapter 5. Bertie, the pint-sized elf, slept in the cellar and emerged with his overbearingly chipper attitude the next day, as Gretchen stumbled around the kitchen making tea. The guy had agreed to the decision to keep him under lock and key without complaint, even before Gretchen explained Mulligan's proclivity to night prowling. She was getting a bad feeling about his future in the big bad world. Bertie seemed just as likely to hand himself over willingly to another master. Okay. Gretchen rubbed her eyes and blinked. You'll have to tell me about the layout of the shop. Sure. Bertie climbed the rungs of a ladder-back chair and hopped onto the table. What do you want to know? Gretchen fetched a stubby pencil and a sheaf of parchment to nudge toward the elf. I was in there for a whole of 5 minutes. I want to see every window and door in the place, where your friends are kept and what kind of obstacles will get in my way. Though the elf had to use 2 hands to sketch the map, his drawing was detailed and intricate, and he chattered away as he described the layout. And nobody goes back there, not a soul. His deliveries come from the warehouse, and the men carry crates of supplies only as far as the hallway. Of an evening, we're locked in this cupboard, he gestured with the tip of the pencil, and the master keeps his keys secured on his belt. There haven't been any break-ins, Gretchen frowned. Sheesh, that'd be a first. Once, Bertie nodded, but through the front windows. When we heard, we began shouting. It only frightened them off. Gretchen stared at the map and tried to figure the most efficient way in. Smashing glass won't give us much time if the guards overhear. We could be arrested before we can prove your friends are in there. The back door looked reinforced, but if I brew up something corrosive enough, I could very well melt the lock clear off the door. Piper emerged from her bedroom, scratching her head, and looked between the pair. So, when are we going? We? Gretchen's eyes boggled. Kid, I'm about to go breaking and entering. The authorities will have a field day on what kind of example I'm setting. If you were there, they'd say I was unfit. But you'll prove them wrong. Piper nodded earnestly. It will be justified once they know about the elves? Maybe. Gretchen wasn't so sure. Or that worm Ewan slithers out of it unscathed. You'll stay with Uncle Jurgen. And even if I do get arrested, I should be out of the clink in a couple of days. Piper gritted her teeth, and her face took on that mulish look Gretchen was coming to expect from her. And how will you get them all out of the city? 10, wasn't it? Gretchen blinked. That was a problem for the elves, she figured. I only agreed to get them out, kid. Once they're free, it's up to them. But they'll be recaptured, Piper huffed. And they won't know their way around. We need to bring them back here. After that, they can find a way to get back home. Gretchen narrowed her eyes at Bertie, who was making no attempt to dissuade the girl. Instead, he rolled the pencil on his knees, looking forlorn. If they were all like him, Gretchen reckoned the elves were done for. She rubbed the bridge of her nose and sighed. Okay, they all go in the pouch, and I'll bring them back. You don't need to be there. The guards are always in the market square. Piper put her hands on her hips. Their rounds are like clockwork. If there's any noise from the shop, they'll hear it. Piper's tone implied that she'd already given the problem some thought, So Gretchen leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. And? A distraction. Piper wore a cat-got-the-canary grin. Over in the banker's quarter, fireworks, or something that will make a big bang noise. Gretchen's heart leaped into her throat at the notion of Piper carrying out a local act of terrorism. She knew she should put the brakes on the plan then and there, make a report to the authorities and have done with it. But if Ewan was brazen enough to keep the elves in the city, Gretchen knew he must have had some very good contingency plans in place. You'll leave the brewing to me, and as soon as you've planted that thing, you'll hightail it over to the stable boy's loft, you hear? Piper nodded somberly, and Gretchen fought a growing sense of dread. And if anything goes wrong, you go straight to the academy and ask for Cordelia Mirkwood. You tell her everything. Piper and Bertie began chattering in excited whispers, but Gretchen didn't hear what they said. She'd been Piper's caretaker for all of a few weeks, and already she was doing exactly what her sister said she would. Something stupid. But she couldn't reconcile with leaving the elves to their fate in the name of responsible parenting, even if she had her own problems to deal with. If she messed this up, both Cordelia and Piper's parents would get exactly what they wanted. The fear of letting Piper down sent a chill down her spine. Right. Gretchen slapped the table and stood. A lock-melting brew and something to scare the pants off the city guard calls for the outside cauldron. By the time Gretchen peeled off her heavy-duty leather smock and carried both stoppered bottles inside, it was mid-afternoon. Bertie was regaling Piper with tales of the Arctic by the fire, and Gretchen stowed the potions in her pouch with a sigh. Time to make a move. She held the pouch open and nodded to Bertie. Climb in. But it stinks, Piper protested. Those hides are awful. Bertie said he almost fainted when he got in. Gretchen couldn't refute the statement. Even with the leather laces loose, a nasty odour wafted from the pouch's infinite depths. Too bad. This is a covert operation. Sacrifices need to be made. But I can take my broom. Piper puffed herself up. We can bring the elves home in sacks. Nope. Gretchen shook her head. Not happening. That sluggish stick of the broom is fine for beginners, but the guards would catch you up on foot. Piper glared, but Gretchen stood her ground. That was what parents were supposed to do. But a niggle in the back of her mind ensued, and she grunted. I'll bring the broom with us, just in case you need it. But there's no way we're using it to escape. Piper grinned, and Gretchen rolled her eyes. Bertie approached the pouch apprehensively, but did as he was bid, and soon the trio boarded Gretchen's broom and sped toward the city. On the way, Gretchen fretted over all the details, whether people would think it was peculiar that she'd show up in the city at closing time, or if she should set up her stand and sell a few potions to keep up appearances. The academy could be a good refuge to while away some hours until nightfall, but after her spat with Cordelia, it was the last place she was likely to go. Was the Swine and Claw too unsavoury to take Piper to? By the time they touched down behind the stables, Gretchen was nowhere nearer to a resolution, and took Piper by the elbow before she could run off to see her friends. There was one shop she hadn't visited in a while, and browsing at Elod's Emporium wouldn't raise too many eyebrows. Not that she had money to burn with her newly acquired debt. Elod's was located on the Wizard's Strip in the city nearing the castle proper. While witches and wizards tended to steer clear of one another, there were some magical applications more suited to the opposite sex. A flu of the masculine variety was best treated by a witch's cure, while protection and warding charms were undoubtedly stronger with a wizard's touch. They weren't bad with enchantments either, if her infinity pouch was anything to go by, and she wondered what Elod could tell her about enchanting items for regular folk. When she held the door to the Emporium open for Piper, she looked up at Gretchen with a frown. "What are we doing here?" she asked. Gretchen tapped the side of her nose and plugged both nostrils with a spare handkerchief. "Elod isn't bad for a wizard. Doesn't make me sneeze much either." They entered the darkened shop and sidled past boxes and dusty shelves with magical curiosities displayed. Gretchen minded the creepy withered hand that twitched of its own volition as they passed and approached the desk, where a dark, hooded figure sat hunched over a stack of papers. "Gretchen Mirkwood." Elod's voice was reedy, and he didn't bother looking up. "And young Piper, the magical world is abuzz with talk of you, little one." Gretchen frowned, recalling the wizard's annoying know-all attitude, then clasped Piper's hand in hers. "Elod, nice to see you. The place looks great." The wizard chuckled in a breathy whisper and stood to his full height, towering over the pair. "You have mischief written all over you this evening. What brings you to my emporium?" "Well, I've been meaning to stop by, been a little busy." She picked up a paperweight from the desk and peered at the strange, petrified beetle inside. "I can't say I was happy when I figured out herbs wouldn't keep in this pouch of yours. And the stink, well, that should have been put right up top of the label." The wizard wore a bemused expression on his ancient features and nodded. "But that's not why you're here?" "No. If you have a minute, I'd like to ask you a few questions on enchantments." If Elod was taken aback, he didn't show it and led them off to a corner with velvet sofas crowded around a fireplace. They sat, and Gretchen reckoned Piper sat closer than usual as her eyes flickered around the darkened recesses of the room. "It wouldn't have anything to do with these creatures, would it?" Elod tapped on a glass enclosure on a stand, and Gretchen squinted before recognizing a Krampus frog inside. "Got one of those already, huh? Hope you didn't pay too much. They're in abundant supply in Edgewater." It reminded Gretchen of her promise to Gavin, and she wondered how much to tell the wizard to avoid giving away trade secrets. "What can you tell me about them?" "Not much, I'm afraid." He tapped the glass, and the frog jumped. "I'm sure you already know they still covet silver and liquor, though they feed much the same as an amphibian would." It was a shame, but Gretchen thought that boded well for Gavin's enterprise. "I'm not here about that anyway. I'd like to know whether it's possible to enchant items for regular folks, something they could trigger themselves." "Well, sure." Elod looked at her like she was daft. "Harold down the road sells plenty of warding stones, pre-enchanted of course, but his light charms sell like hotcakes." Gretchen shook her head. "Those are single use. They last an hour at the most before they fizzle." "Ah," the wizard tapped his knee. "For more regular enchantments, the sword that sharpens itself, or the broom that sweeps of its own accord. Those were a fad a few centuries back, but I'm afraid they can become a bit of a liability." "Oh, like how?" "Well, like the light charms, they either stop working after a time, which leads to irritated customers, or fail catastrophically." He waggled his eyebrows. "What, like boom?" "Indeed," Elod chortled. "Usually of the person's own doing, of course, picking apart the item to see how it works. But it landed more than a few witches and wizards in hot water." "I see." Gretchen sagged, feeling her last vestige of hope to dig herself out of a hole dashed completely. "Thank you for your time, Elod." "My pleasure." The wizard stood and held an arm toward the door. "And about the herbs. You should store them in the freezer section of the pouch." Gretchen's mouth gaped, and when she went to speak, it came out as an undignified squeak. "It has a freezer section? How the heck did I miss that?" Elod's wizened face cracked into a wide grin. "It's an infinity pouch. There is quite a lot of room inside." Chapter 6. Out on the street, Gretchen blinked at the night sky. She hadn't realized so much time had passed in the Emporium. The moon shone a little brighter than she would have liked, but there wasn't a single cloud despite the cold. It boded well for escape if the weather held, and Gretchen mentally ran through the plan for the umpteenth time when Piper tugged on her sleeve with a worried frown. Gretchen wondered if the old wizard had spooked her. "What's wrong, kid?" "Bertie," she blinked. "He's not in the freezer section, is he?" Gretchen's eyes bulged as she considered the possibility, but she quickly dismissed it. "Nah, if I can't find it, he sure won't. Besides, he's an Arctic elf for Pete's sake." The troubled look didn't leave the girl's features, and Gretchen sighed as she veered her toward an alleyway. After casting around for any onlookers, she opened her pouch and called out, "Bertie!" The elf stuck his head out, and while the stench of the raw hides accompanied him, he didn't appear poorly. "Is it done?" Excitement shone in his eyes. "Nah, just checking you didn't get caught in the freezer." The elf shook his head. "I looked inside that doorway. It looked rather full inside." Gretchen blinked, stuck on the notion that she could have a freezer full of steak she had no idea about. But lurking in a dark alley whispering was a good way to come to the city guard's notice, so she shook her head with an irritated click of her teeth. "Back inside then. It should be over soon." Piper followed along as Gretchen led her toward the market square to check that the coast was clear. They stopped across the way and ducked into a merchant's inn where they ate a hasty meal. Gretchen didn't recognize any of her fellow stallholders among the patrons, and her anxiety dropped a notch. It had been a risk to visit the inn in the first place, but Gretchen had to be sure Ewan wasn't sitting at a window seat keeping an eye on his shop. "Can we go now?" Piper dragged a sleeve over her mouth and wrinkled her nose. "It stinks in here," says the kid who hangs out in a stable most days. Gretchen rolled her eyes, but couldn't argue that the place was a bit of a dive. She could poke fun at the salt and bog all she liked, but at least Jurgen kept a clean establishment. "All right, I'll come with you to the bank." I know, Piper rolled her eyes. Gretchen harumphed, but preteen attitude aside, even whispering the plan within earshot was probably a bad idea. Gretchen downed the last of her ale, stood, and then the pair made their way into the night, with Piper activating her warming cloak and Gretchen tugging on her gloves. The banking quarter was a fair way off. Hoping that the citizens of the city stuck to their warm hearths, Gretchen kept up a brisk pace, figuring that hustling under lamplight made their journey less obvious to any onlookers. Before they approached the turn where street lamps were in better supply and the street widened, Gretchen nudged Piper to pull her hood up, and likewise did the same. Few solitary figures passed them, and when they approached the formidable wall of fortress-like bank facades, Gretchen dropped a well-packed parcel on the sidewalk. With deft fingers, she unspooled coiled fuse in her pocket, slowing her pace to be sure it unwound without coming free. She didn't risk a glance upward at the watchtower jutting above a nearby building, and prayed the fuse would make the distance to the single alleyway in the street. When they slipped into the alley, and Gretchen pulled a handful of fuse from her pocket, she let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Her palms were clammy, and she rubbed them on her skirt and passed the remaining length of fuse to Piper. "Now remember, 10 minutes, Piper groaned. "Then to the stables. I've got it." Gretchen squinted down the alleyway. "Are you sure this leads to the foundry?" "Yes, there's a wall, but I've climbed it before." Rather than worry on the fact she was raising a street kid, Gretchen ruffled Piper's hair. She had one more trick up her sleeve, and while it made more sense for Gretchen to use it, she pressed the small vial into Piper's palm. "What's this?" Piper asked. "An invisibility potion," Gretchen bit her lip. "It's not perfect. Uncle Jurgen saw right through one, but it will hide you in the shadows if the guards catch up, so long as you keep still." "Wow." Piper stared down at the potion. "You have to teach me how to make this." "Beyond my skill, kid," Gretchen shrugged. "I bought that from a crooked wizard who passes by the salt and bog now and then. This isn't something you'd find at a regular potion store." Piper squinted as though she could learn the secrets within the clear liquid if she stared hard enough. "Oh." Another example of her top-rate parenting, Gretchen mused, handing over contraband magic to a kid. "All right, time to get this show on the road." Gretchen's stomach tied in knots as she strode away from the alley, leaving Piper behind. Her conscience screamed at her for leaving a 10-year-old in the city streets after dark, but she reasoned that she'd armed the kid with enough defensive charms, should she be waylaid. That, on top of her streetwise know-how, would keep her safe. The route back to the market square was clear, and Gretchen stuck to the shadows where she could. Empty stalls stood waiting for the morning's trade with more opulent shops looming around them. Her fellow traders grouched about the few street lamps dotted around, saying the square should be afforded better protection from the guards. Yet the darkness suited her just fine as she crept to Ewan's shop, her heart hammered in her chest, and her mind raced 1,000,000 miles an hour. Sure she was forgetting something, but committed nonetheless, she slipped down the lane toward the back door and the Arctic elves' freedom. Mindful not to spill any of the caustic lock-melting brew on either herself or her heated gloves, she held the vial at arm's reach and poured the contents carefully over the door handle. As gelatinous as it was, the mixture stuck to the metal in an awful purple blob, and acrid smoke plumed from the mechanism. She watched with bated breath, staring as the lever bubbled and warped, and recoiled when an almighty bang erupted. Pressed against the far brick wall of the laneway, Gretchen turned her eyes upward, waiting for the smoke which should be visible any second, then cursed herself for wasting precious time. Narrowing her eyes at the fortified door of the leathersmith's, she pulled a stout metal rod from her pouch and jammed it into the disintegrating lock with a disconcerting squelch. Using it as a lever, she wrenched the rod sideways, pushed, and the heavy door swung inward inch by inch. After yanking the rod clear, she grimaced at its twisted point and held it clear of her person as it fizzled. So far, so good, she told herself. In a matter of minutes, the elves would be free, and she'd be off to the stables to collect Piper. But when her boot touched the timber boards of the dark hallway, she realized what she was forgetting. A wailing siren blared seemingly from everywhere, and Gretchen clenched her teeth and balled her fists. Of course he'd warded the shop. Ewan would take no chances given the incriminating evidence inside. Hoping beyond hope the city guards were too busy with the sound explosion to notice, Gretchen hurried inside and opened her pouch in a panic. "Bertie, get out here! We're in a timeline here. The place is rigged up with wards." The elf stuck his head out and clambered up and out onto the boards. "My apologies, I didn't know." Yeah. Gretchen pitched her voice to be heard over the siren. "Come on!" The pair rushed into the workshop, and Bertie pointed to the cupboard he'd sketched on the map. A heavy padlock dangled from a stout hinge welded into a frame, but Gretchen jammed the still bubbling rod into the lock and waited. This time the metal didn't immediately disintegrate, and Gretchen worried that it was some kind of charmed alloy, impervious to magic. The guards would turn up soon. It was only a matter of time. She twisted the rod, attempting to hasten the effects, and as she pulled downward, the padlock snapped open. Then a white gas poured into the room from the mechanism. Holding her breath, she yanked the door open. A small row of hammocks swung from shelves, and frightened little faces within stared back at her. Bertie rushed forward, climbing up each shelf, calling for the elves to come down. Gretchen untied her pouch from her belt and held it open, but then made the mistake of drawing a breath through her nose. Her last thought was that she could really use one of those padlocks at home before she hit the floor and the world went black. When she came around, Gretchen blinked up at the guard hovering over her, contempt plain on his features. "And you say she bears you some kind of ill will?" He looked up, and Gretchen tried to turn her head to see who was behind them. "The woman was in my shop just days past raving about an illegal venture. Wanted financial backing. Of course I turned her away and, well, here she is." Gretchen's tongue felt too big for her mouth as she tried to speak. All that came out of her mouth was a garbled sound, and the guard nudged her in the ribs with a boot. "Awake then, hag. I'll wager it was you with the funny business in the banking quarter too. Bloody magical types. If I had it my way, we would allow none of you within miles of the city." Now! Ewan's voice was oily. "Magic does a great service for honest citizens. Why, Harold's warding charms worked just perfectly. I will most certainly recommend his services to my fellow traders." Ewan defending magic? Gretchen thought the gas must have addled his brain too. "I don't like it myself," the guard grunted. "What did this smoke do to her anyhow?" "There's nothing to fear. Its effects are intended only for the person who tampers with the lock. Simply subdues them until they are apprehended." Gretchen blinked and patted her belt where her pouch was missing. Craning her head, she saw it discarded against the wall, and the door to the cupboard was closed and locked with a more ordinary-looking padlock. "Very well. We shall get this wretch to the dungeons." Rough hands pulled Gretchen to her feet, though her muscles felt like jelly. Slung between two men, her boots scraped on the floor as they hauled her out through the front, and she screeched in a wordless cry. By the time she found her tongue, they were in the square, and Gretchen dug in her boot heels and snarled. "My pouch! It's in there. I can explain. I just need—" "Quiet, wench." The guard who'd done the talking inside snarled. "It's off to the dungeons for you, and then before the magistrate in the morning." A glimmer from the corner of her eye caught Gretchen's attention, and she turned to its source by an empty stall. The air shimmered, and Gretchen warred with both irritation that Piper hadn't stuck to the plan and relief that she could convey a message back to the academy. "My pouch has all the evidence. It's in that shop. Once the academy hears of this, you'll all be done for." The guards only laughed and hauled her forward. Gretchen just hoped Piper wouldn't get any ideas and would go straight to Cordelia. Chapter 7. Gretchen stared at the solitary leak in her cell dripping from a hole in the mortar. It was like they designed dungeons to leak, in Gretchen's estimation, all part of the atmosphere, but taking the time to reflect on her choices was sobering, and by the time a sliver of sunlight shone through the barred window, she knew she only had herself to blame for her predicament. If the guards couldn't be trusted to investigate slavery complaints against upstanding citizens, then she should have taken Bertie to the academy so he could appeal to the witches' council. What had gotten in the way was her pride and personal grudge, and it had ended in disaster. Piper was lost to her, all her possessions forfeit against an impossible debt, and all she had to look forward to was what kind of sentence was in store for her. Gretchen hoped, at least in some part, that her time with Piper had instilled the skills she'd need to wade through the politics of the magical world and come to her full potential. Once she was a fully fledged witch, Gretchen knew she'd be a force to be reckoned with. Maybe then she'd have some time to spare for an old friend who'd likely be serving drinks at the Salt and Bog in exchange for food and lodgings. When a guard came past to smash his baton against the bars, Gretchen stood and sighed. This early? I figured the magistrate would be enjoying a leisurely breakfast. Ha! The guard barked a laugh. His worship prefers righteousness in the morning. I hear he has a bowel complaint which is much availed by a severe sentence. Great, Gretchen mused. A crabby old guy with piles would send her to the noose for breaking and entering. She wondered if offering an ointment to remedy the condition would help or hinder her cause. The guard unlocked her cell and jangled a pair of irons in his hand. Gretchen held her wrists out, resigned and without a single sharp retort sprinting to mind. After securing her, the guard pointed to the corridor, and Gretchen sighed and trudged out. The dungeon's layout led through a series of iron gates to a passageway which she assumed led to the courthouse. It remained dank and dark until they reached a door at the end, which opened into an oak-panelled waiting room of sorts. Gretchen blinked at the bright light, and the guard pushed her onto a bench seat by the wall. She'd assumed she was the first case of the day, but a scruffy old beggar wheezed a laugh and gave her ribs a jovial nudge with an elbow. "And what have you been up to, madam? Nothing too deviant, I hope." Gretchen wrinkled her nose at the stale booze on the man's breath and grunted. "Ugh, nothing compared to your transgressions, I'll wager. Answering to the heinous crime of not brushing your teeth for a decade." The man only laughed in answer, and a clerk poked his head through the next door. "His Honour is ready for this one." Gretchen thought he'd meant her for a second, but the guard hauled the beggar to his feet with a huff. "Time to go, Frederick. I think you've worn out all your get-out-of-jail-free cards." The man let out a pathetic whine and bad breath, or no, Gretchen felt a twinge of sympathy for the guy. After, the guard returned and looked Gretchen up and down. She ventured a question on Frederick's fate. "Him?" The guard snorted. "Found in the cellar of a reputable tavern drinking their finest brandy. Not the first time either. His Honour won't be happy with him, like as not to send him to a work camp to dry out for a few years." "Years?" Gretchen clicked her teeth shut, wondering how her crime stacked up against Frederick's. "Little harsh, isn't it?" The guard shook his head and leaned against the wall, apparently done with the conversation. Minutes dragged on, and Gretchen leaned her head back against the wall, wondering how she could argue her way out of this one. The evidence was the slaves themselves, and she had no way of knowing if Bertie had gotten everyone rounded up and into the pouch, or if they remained locked in the cupboard. She was thinking on whether her sister would believe Piper when the door opened, and Gretchen startled. Frederick kept his eyes on the floor with a defeated look about him, and Gretchen swallowed as the guard chortled and led him away back to the dungeon. With those precious few minutes to herself, Gretchen only paid escape half a mind, and decided if she was going down, she would take Ewan with her. If she got a chance, she'd throttle the twerp with her irons. The guard returned, and Gretchen stood, waiting to be called in. With her chin held high, she ignored the guard's bemused expression and didn't so much as flinch when the clerk popped his head in. The courtroom she entered was smaller than the People's Court, where the king presided at times to deal with disputes. A scowling old man sat at a desk elevated above rows of bench seats, with a railed box to the side which she assumed was for the accused to sit. But Gretchen's breath caught as she scanned the front row, where Cordelia and Piper sat some distance from Ewan. Her sister's stare was frosty, and Piper chewed her lip like she always did when she was anxious. Rage quickly overcame a pang in her heart at the notion that her sister had brought the girl along to witness what the Academy would consider poetic justice. She was aware of the fact she was standing frozen on the spot and drew a deep breath to slow her heart when the magistrate roared for her to sit. Gretchen complied, and the magistrate straightened a stack of papers on his desk. Gretchen Mirkwood, you stand accused of breaking and entering, property damage, assault, carrying prohibited substances, and 1 count of terrorism by means of explosion. Assault? Gretchen mouthed to herself, trying to figure out where that one had come from. The sheriff will submit his evidence. You may make counter-arguments afterward, or seek legal counsel before I make a ruling. He leaned forward, rather uncomfortably, Gretchen thought, and scowled. It's always the guilty ones who want the legal counsel. It seemed like righteousness was pretty close to the mark, and Gretchen tried not to make a face as the magistrate stared her down. Your Honour, if I may? A man with silver hair tied at the nape of his neck stood and inclined his head. Gretchen supposed he was the sheriff. Proceed. The guards on duty submitted their report, which you will find among the documents. Additionally, we would have testimony from Mr. Ewan Carlyle, part owner and proprietor of Carlyle's leather goods. I've read the report, the magistrate confirmed. Bring up your man. Gretchen opened her mouth to protest, figuring she should have a copy of the documents, then shut it when she realised there probably wasn't a lot to argue with on their account. She'd been there while they'd arrested her, after all. Ewan was another matter, though, and she curled her lip as he stood to approach the lectern where the sheriff stood. Mr. Carlyle, what say you? The magistrate shifted in his seat, and Gretchen noted the cushion under his sizable rump. Your Honour, Ewan bent in a deep bow, and his face was a picture of sincere conviction. I have known the Mirkwood woman for some time, and she approached me the day before yesterday with a wicked proposition. Wicked my foot, Gretchen thought, and twisted the irons on her wrists. A plan, she said, to partner with me in the business of selling enchanted goods, untested and without approval from the magical authorities. His beady eyes gleamed. I refused, of course, and that's when she struck me. That's not true! Piper stood and bunched her fists at her side. Cordelia tugged at her sleeve, and the girl looked between the magistrate who glowered and Gretchen's sister. Well, it isn't! Sit down, child, the magistrate snapped. Piper did as she was bidden, and the magistrate waited until the clerk had finished scratching down the transcript with his quill. Anything else, Mr. Carlyle? Ewan had the tenacity to sneer at Gretchen as he said, After that, the witch made threats, said she would ruin me. I suspect that was her purpose in my shop, to plant some sinister item to discredit me publicly. That was rich, Gretchen thought, but she puzzled on whether that meant the elves had gotten away after all, or if he was planting the seeds of his supposed innocence for another time. You were there on the night of the break-in, the report says, arriving before the guards, according to the reports. The magistrate squinted at his papers. What transpired? Only minutes before, Your Worship. My premises is fitted with wards and protective mechanisms against theft, provided by the reputable heralds in the Wizard's Strip. The witch was subdued by the time I arrived. And was there anything missing from your inventory? The magistrate arched an eyebrow. Ewan shook his head. No, Your Worship. You may sit, Mr. Carlyle. The magistrate waved him away and scrawled some notes of his own. Miss Mirkwood, the evidence is compelling. Will you be making a full confession to spare the court time? Absolutely not, Gretchen summoned her most belligerent smile. But I do have plenty to say. The court favours brevity, Miss Mirkwood, the magistrate warned. You do not wish to seek legal counsel? Cordelia stood, and Gretchen wondered if she would add to the cause of prosecution or defence. She already has legal counsel, Your Worship. Cordelia Mirkwood, Vice-Chancellor of the Witches' Academy. Gretchen drew a sharp breath through her nose, and the magistrate tapped the end of his quill on the desk in irritation. Very well, Chancellor. Do you propose an adjournment to confer with your client? That won't be necessary. Her voice was clipped, and she approached the lectern with a frosty stare at the sheriff, who backed away. I would argue, Your Worship, that the wrong person is sitting in that dock. Gretchen, as a member of our guild, did this kingdom a service by uncovering slavery within our very city. Whatever uncharitable thoughts Gretchen had entertained about her sister melted away in that moment. When Cordelia reached into a fold of her cloak and produced the infinity pouch, Gretchen sagged back in her seat in relief. She knew what was coming next, and as Cordelia undid the laces, elves climbed out one by one and lined up in silence. Gretchen didn't know where to look. The magistrate stood to lean over his desk, staring down at Bertie and his fellow elves, while the blood drained from Ewan's face entirely as he watched the spectacle open-mouthed. After Gretchen counted all 10, Cordelia stowed the pouch away and addressed the magistrate. "I would have Mr. Bertie Burrows give an account of his captivity. He will attest to the fact that Mr. Carlyle bought he and his companions as workers for his enterprise." "This is highly irregular." The magistrate shook his head and sat with a wince. "And how does this excuse the actions of your client, Vice-Chancellor?" Cordelia turned her nose up in the air. "There is a provision in common law for both the Wizards' Guild and the Witches' Academy to undertake investigations when magic is at play, your worship." "That," the magistrate countered, "is only seen as reasonable by the courts when conducted under the direction of such establishments. Are you submitting that Miss Mirkwood was such an agent?" Cordelia cocked her head with a half-smile. "I'm here, aren't I?" "Nicely done, sis," Gretchen conceded. Deft words and half-truths may just have saved her bacon. "This is grey legal territory, Vice-Chancellor." The magistrate shook his head. "And, quite frankly, a mess. I'm adjourning the matter with a directive that the Academy provide a detailed report. Your member is not off the hook yet, not until you provide sufficient evidence that Mr. Carlyle is guilty. I order that Mr. Carlyle be placed under house arrest until he returns to court." Just before he could drop the gavel, Cordelia held up a finger. "If I may, given the risk of Mr. Carlyle fleeing, we would like to use magic within legal bounds to secure him in his home, along with his brother, who we also submit was part of this heinous conspiracy." The magistrate's eyebrows furrowed as he considered the request. "I am inclined to grant the request, so long as you understand, Vice-Chancellor, that I will hold you personally responsible if that one," he pointed at Gretchen, "goes missing." "Of course." Cordelia inclined her head. "Very well. This case is adjourned. Guards, release the accused." Gretchen stood with her wrists outstretched. "Thank you, your worshipness. If I may. As a token of my gratitude, I'd like to offer my services. I've got an ointment that will clear up those—" "Silence!" The magistrate thumped his gavel and his face turned beet red. "You're skating on thin ice, madam. You'd be well advised to keep your mouth shut." Gretchen grinned sardonically and shrugged. "I hear that a lot." Chapter 8. For the most part, Gretchen, Cordelia, Piper, and the elves walked back to the academy in silence. Gretchen wasn't sure what to think, and Piper didn't quite meet her eye as they trod up the steps to the academy. "Show Bertie and his friends to the dining hall, would you, Piper?" Cordelia nodded to a hallway by the stairs. Piper's eyes flickered between Cordelia and Gretchen, but she nodded and rounded the elves up. Gretchen opened her mouth to say something, anything, but couldn't find the words. She felt like a failure for having let the kid down. Cordelia strode off toward the staircase, and Gretchen faced the decision to turn on her heel and walk out or take responsibility for her actions. If not for Piper, she may just have scarpered. Instead, she climbed the ridiculous number of stairs that led to Cordelia's office and sat slumped in front of her desk. "You don't have to say it." Gretchen folded her arms. "The whole I told you so thing." Cordelia sat with a sigh and steepled her fingers on the desk. "You're just lucky that girl is about as foolhardy as you." Gretchen screwed her face up in a questioning look. "The pouch. After they arrested you, it was Piper who retrieved it from the shop. Came here in a panic, begging me to go straight to the dungeons to demand your release." She rolled her eyes. "After she calmed down, we had a long talk about the situation." Gretchen rubbed her forehead. "I told her to go straight to you if I didn't make it back to the stables. I'm not sure I could have pulled the right strings to demand the pouch back if she didn't act. But she told me she'd overheard our spat in the market. She knew about the money troubles you were facing." Gretchen felt her cheeks burn, and cursed herself for not minding Piper's tendency to listen in. She insisted the debt was hers alone after the events of Christmas Eve, and offered her services to the academy to repay it. Cordelia couldn't quite hide a smirk. On the proviso, I come to your aid, and uncover the leathersmith's crimes, of course. Gretchen laughed and shook her head. Typical. She really is something special, and I don't just mean her abilities. Cordelia sighed and rubbed her chin. I can see how much she means to you, and you to her. I still stand by what I said, though. She needs proper training to keep her powers in check, but perhaps boarding isn't the solution. No? Gretchen frowned. What do you propose? Piper told me you planned on sending her to a school. She thought the notion quite absurd. How did she put it? I might as well be learning something useful, I believe. Cordelia raised her eyebrows. Send her here instead. You're in the city for work. After lessons are finished for the day, you can come and collect her. That her sister had backed down on her demands was almost irreconcilable, but Gretchen knew it wasn't her arguments that had Cordelia backpedaling. Sending Piper to the academy at all sent a nervous shiver up her spine, but Gretchen had to admit that it would happen some day. Perhaps this was the middle ground neither of them had considered ceding to. She's agreed to this. It was her suggestion, Cordelia shrugged. I know you're worried, but it will be clear among the academy which family the girl belongs to. She's fiercely loyal to you, and us Mirkwoods stick together. A wave of guilt bloomed in Gretchen's belly, and she reached across the desk to clasp her sister's hand. I'm sorry, I was being pig-headed, as usual. Look where it got me, huh? She laughed mirthlessly. Perhaps that's one trait we share. Cordelia gave her hand a squeeze. But a good deed was done in the end. Those elves would still be enslaved if events hadn't unfolded as they did. I suppose. Gretchen puffed out her cheeks. Just tell me you've given up on the heated gloves idea. Cordelia narrowed her eyes. They don't exist for a reason. Yeah, Gretchen sighed. I've already given up on those. Very good. Cordelia flipped through a stack of papers on her desk and cleared her throat. Now, I'll instruct the Treasury to pay the claim for damages to Edgewater and prepare a report for the court. Piper's had hardly a wink of sleep. I suggest you get her home and tucked into bed. Gretchen stood and gave a mock wince. Another report, huh? I seem to be good at heaping the paperwork on you. And thank you, by the way. Not many people would lie to the court to save someone else's skin. I didn't lie. There were faint echoes of humour lining Cordelia's eyes, but it was a very near thing. Entertaining 10 tiny house guests was low on Gretchen's list of things she'd rather be doing with her time, but Piper had insisted the elves return to the cottage with them. The next morning, Piper handed Gretchen a cup of tea with one of those steely looks that promised an argument. The elves had all gone out into the garden, which Gretchen thought suspicious. They don't want to leave. She folded her arms. They what now? Gretchen took a sip and frowned. Piper, they can't stay here. Then we need to find them somewhere to live. They're scared of going home and getting snatched up again. All they need is jobs. We can help with that. Gretchen tried to ignore the indignation on the girl's features. Last time I checked, I wasn't a jobs officer. If they don't want to go back to the snow, they can look in the newspaper like regular folk. But a pounding at the door made them both jump. Then Piper went to answer it. Gavin poked his head in the door, and Gretchen caught her breath, wondering when the day would come when a knock at the door didn't send a wave of dread over her. Hey! Gretchen stood to fetch another teacup. What brings you here? Just seeing how you're coming along with the frogs, Gretchen recalled. Sheesh. It's been a busy few days, Gavin. Forgot about it completely. The silversmith's face fell, and she pointed to the door. Well, not completely, but I haven't checked on the little experiment we set up. Taking her lead, Gavin headed back outside, and Piper was hot on Gretchen's heels. After prying the door of the greenhouse open, they bent to shuffle inside, and observed the mess of broken pots and shredded plants. Typical, Gretchen thought. Krampuses enjoyed all things wreck and ruin, and their frog counterparts appeared just as troublesome. Let me see. Gretchen pushed aside broken ceramic with her boot and made her way over to the silver bowls. The frog was nowhere to be seen, but the dish of liquor she'd left out had dried up. The bowls next to it shimmered faintly, and Gavin lifted one to peer closely at the transformation. "What did you do?" He traced the engravings with his finger. "I have had no luck at the workshop. Just left it some liquor. It was double-distilled witch's brew, if that helps." Gretchen wondered why the bowl seemed so much less luminescent than the original Gavin showed her. "Did you have any booze around on the night the first one started glowing?" Gavin didn't bother to hide his disappointment. "We thought of that. Left brandy, mead, ale, you name it. Nothing since." "Look." Piper bent and picked up a pot that had survived the carnage on the floor. "Wasn't this your pine cone?" Gretchen curled her lip at the shriveled remains of her sprouted experiment. "I think it was." "Pine cone?" Gavin took the pot from Piper's hands and gave it a sniff. "Well, I'll be. This making sense to you?" Gretchen shared a confused look with Piper and waited for Gavin to enlighten them. "Flux," he stated. "I make it with pinecone resin." "I see." Gretchen's mind worked. "But don't you have plenty of that stuff lying around?" Gavin nodded and retrieved the other bowl. "Of course, but I usually keep it in sealed pots to stop it going rancid." "And maybe on that night after too many nips of brandy," Gretchen smirked. Gavin cleared his throat and ducked back out of the greenhouse. "Maybe." In the garden, the elves poked their tiny heads from their hiding places among the foliage. "You can come out," Gretchen sighed. "You don't have to hide anymore, remember?" Gavin eyed her askance, and Gretchen rubbed the bridge of her nose. "You better come in. I'll need a steady stream of tea to explain this lot." Piper seemed torn on whether to stay outside to coax the elves back in, or follow the grown-ups to keep apprised of the conversation. With a resigned look, she remained with her nervous little cohort, and Gretchen thought she would be quite the rights activist when she got older. The weight of responsibility the girl shouldered made Gretchen exhausted just thinking about it, but she remembered back when writing The Wrongs of the World had inspired a similar angsty passion. "Are they hers or something?" Gavin closed the door and made a face. "Was there another incident?" "Nah." Gretchen barked a laugh at the silversmith's apprehension. He of all people knew that she was capable of magic on a large scale. "Let me get the tea, then I can explain everything." Gavin chewed on a cookie as Gretchen neared the end of her long-winded story, and she shrugged as she said, "Turns out I was being overly paranoid. The academy is a lot of things, but it's not all bad. Maybe I was just worried that taking her there would be some kind of betrayal. And at least if Piper's only there through the day, she can let me know if she's having a hard time. But from the way Cordelia spoke about my girl, I reckon it'd be her sorting out the bullies before I even knew they existed." Gavin nodded absently, though Gretchen saw the wheels in his head turning. "So, the academy will pay the claim?" "Yep." Gretchen took a sip from her cup. "You should be well placed to increase production if the pine resin flux works." Gavin opened his mouth and shut it again. "What?" Gretchen asked. "Well," he rubbed his chin, "increasing production is one thing, but having the right people." Gretchen slapped the table and gasped. "The elves! You're taking them! Piper said they don't even want to go back home. You have plenty of space in your workshop. I've seen the way Mulligan's eyeing them off. It's only a matter of time before he—" Gavin held up a hand to silence her and narrowed his eyes. "Maybe. You said they were craftspeople. If they are skilled with silver, I'll have a place for them. But remember last time you brought me a worker?" Gretchen hid a smirk behind her cup as she recalled twisting Gavin's arm into taking on Jürgen as a labourer. It seemed like a million years ago. Then, of course, he'd had an allergic reaction to the acid the silversmith worked with and blew up like a balloon. That had been an eventful day at the Salton Bog. "I don't think these ones will give you any trouble. In fact, you'll have to snap them out of mindless servitude." Gavin turned the teacup in his hand, but the look on his face was playful. "Servitude, eh? I could do with a little more of that." Gretchen rolled her eyes and sighed. "Well, you'll have to mind yourself. Piper's pegged herself as their protector. I wouldn't be surprised to see her counting their wages to make sure they don't get shortchanged." Gavin laughed, and Piper opened the door, ushering the small troop inside. She looked like a right mother hen, and Gavin tipped his head in a wordless agreement for her to pass on the news. "Good timing," Gretchen cleared her throat. "We were just talking about you folks needing some honest work. I don't know what your skills are like with silver, but Gavin here could do with a hand at his workshop." Piper broke out into a wide grin, and the elves whispered among themselves. It was Bertie who stepped forward with his hands clasped behind his back to speak. We have experience working with metals from our home forges, but silver was in short supply. If you would have us on a trial basis, we would work diligently under your supervision to demonstrate our skills. Diligently wasn't the word, Gretchen mused. She hoped they would at least get used to sleeping outside a cupboard. I think that's fair. Gavin nodded slowly. We have room for you to lodge at the workshop until you find more suitable accommodations and... How much will you pay them? Piper interrupted. Gavin and Gretchen shared a long-suffering look and laughed. We can discuss it after a week's trial. Gavin gave Piper a mock severe stare. With you there to supervise the negotiations? Piper gave a haughty nod, and Gretchen burst out laughing, wondering if she'd picked up that expression from Cordelia. What? Piper planted her fists on her hips. Oh, nothing, kid, Gretchen wheezed. I just never thought that after the last few days everything would have worked out so neatly. Piper narrowed her eyes, but the excited whispers of the elves soon distracted her. They spoke so fast Gretchen could barely catch a word. Gloves aside, everything had worked out in the end. And she thought perhaps she may come up with a solution for that little venture anyhow, with just a bit more testing, and a few pairs of gloves. Thank you for joining me on the journey through An Elvish Sweatshop, Episode 9 of the Gretchen's Misadventures series. If you've enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more enchanting readings and fantastical tales. Share your thoughts on this epic misadventure, or recommend your favourite fantasy reads in the comments below. Your insights are the magic that keeps this community thriving. If you're ready for more of Gretchen and her mystical escapades, give this video a thumbs up and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all things magical right here. Until our next adventure, may your books be filled with wonder and your days with magic. Happy reading!